Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Good. Well, actually, when I say good afternoon, you're supposed to say good afternoon. So, good afternoon. All right, great. I'm Mario Gooden. I'm the director of the Master of Architecture program, and I'm really excited to welcome you to Open House for this fall. And I'm just going to jump right into it. I know that you've had a full day. You just finished a session with students in the M.Arch program. So you've already sort of learned a lot, but I guess I'll kind of give you the official sort of word, if you will, on the program. And I always like to start with this animation because this is, Avery Hall. This is sort of where we are, and this is really the heart of GSAP. Although GSAP is a kind of octopus that spreads out in this quadrant of the campus, underground to the next building, to Schermerhorn. We have classes in Fairweather, in Buell, but this is really the heart, if you will, of GSAP and also the heart of the M.Arch programs. And if you'll see there on the third floor, and hopefully you might have had a chance to visit already. Let's make sure this. Here we go. Avery Library, which is the world's foremost art and architectural library. I'm really always excited to talk about Avery. It was my favorite place in this building when I was a student many, many years ago. And I had a carrel on the 300 level where I would sit and study, but also to be surrounded by books and to be contributing to the archive. So the work that we are doing in the studios, we like to think of as the production of knowledge. The archive of Avery is not simply a repository for historical knowledge, but it's a living archive that we conceptually think of how do we add to the knowledge of architecture. And so, hopefully when you're here, you will find your spot in the 300 level, in the your favorite sort of carrel. But also there's much more to Avery. We have the studios upstairs. There you see we are in wood, or to GSAP, I should say. We have classes and spaces in Fairweather, so snaking underneath and up the stair there. And continuing, oops, I'm going backwards. So on the one hand, we have the production of knowledge, which happens in the studio. We also think about that knowledge historically and how it's related to, let's say, the larger kind of archive. But then we also have, let's say, the materialization of architecture. Bernard Tschumi, Dean Emeritus Bernard Tschumi's sort of axiom is that architecture is the materialization of concept. So I would say that not only are studios important, not only is the library important, but also how do we materialize our ideas and how do they translate into architecture. So again, here we are, and what we do here is not just a kind of, we're not working in a hermetic bubble, but we're also thinking about our relationship to what's going on in the world around us. How does architecture participate in sort of social, cultural, political discourse? Last year, we had a series of what were called actioning summits, where this is a format different, and you perhaps heard the dean speak about this today, different than the kind of usual, let's say, starchitects standing up talking about their work, but we wanted to actually bring groups of, or small groups of, let's say, experts or critical thinkers about issues together to think about what kind of actions can we make as designers of the built environment to confront the pressing issues of our time. This year, we're working, or the Dean's Office has curated a series on coalitions. So last year was about sort of actions. Now, how do we form coalitions? Because this work must be done collectively. And so for the Master of Architecture program, what separates, I would say, GSAP from other schools is that we do not presume to know what architecture is. So if, and the dean perhaps said this as well, if you're coming here because, or if you want to come here because you think we're going to tell you what architecture is, it might not be the right place for you. What we do here is we want to ask high-order questions. Architecture is not a given. It's not a preconceived condition. And as we confront issues of climate change, of anthropocentrism, as we confront issues of spatial violence, as we confront issues of equity, right now, I would say, we are living in a very uncertain times. So how do we practice? How might we practice, let's say, a radical pedagogy of uncertainty as a way of thinking about how do we form strategies or design strategies to address these issues? And so hence, in order to resituate the discipline of architecture, what are strategies for deploying embodied knowledge, confronting extractivism and capital accumulation, constructing mutualism within interspecies ecologies, and modeling spatial reparation? These are some of the questions that we ask in the M.Arch program, and ways in which we sort of look at thinking about architecture not simply as making an object or the formal, let's say, aesthetics of architecture, but architecture as part of a system of relationships, as part of a network, architecture really as part of a broader ecology. And a way of thinking, if you will. And so this is some work from last year from the Advanced Studios, Studio 6 of the M.Arch program, that you can also find online. We'll be sharing other work with you. And we're thinking about working across scales as well. So scales from the scale of detail to the scale of site-specific scales, but also to the scale of territory. And again, how do we think about materials, and how do we materialize concepts to think about architecture? And I'm going to go through some of these very quickly because you are going to hear from some of the faculty who are here, not only to answer your questions, but I'm going to ask them if they would also maybe speak a bit about parts of the curriculum. Again, we're thinking not only within GSAP, but also in relationship to broader issues. This is Race and Modern Architecture, which was edited by Professor Mabel O. Wilson, who's been a long-time faculty here, Irene Ching and Charles Davis. This is Professor Wilson giving one of the Mellon lectures at the National Gallery last spring. And so I'm just going to jump right into the M.Arch curriculum, which are, let's say, organized around the strands, the design studios, technology sequence, the representation sequence, history theory sequence, professional practice, and then you have electives. As you know, it's a 3-year program, but I want to talk more specifically about the organization of the semesters and how we have thought about putting into play this radical pedagogy of uncertainty towards the kinds of questions that we're asking. So in the first 3 semesters, they are, I would say, bracketed, if you will, around questions of architecture and questions of architectural history, between the design studios and also between the history theory sequence. The second 3 semesters, semesters 4 through 6, around asking questions around sort of practice. But practice is actually not limited to those 3 semesters. We actually sort of think about practice throughout all 6 semesters. And so in the first semester, we have, and you'll hear from Professor Maria Lizarraga shortly, questions of architecture, fugitive mobilities, and the current studio called Forms of Mixture. but let's say the key words are embodiment, ecology, environment, care, equity, reparation. And then how do we think about those in terms of scale, in terms of materiality, in terms of the design of space and spatial relationships, in terms of structure, in terms of detail, and in terms of relationships. We have our technology sequence, which starts with our required environment and architecture, architectural representation, ADR1, which is our drawing and, well, not only drawing, but thinking about architectural representation in a myriad of ways. History theory, questions of architectural history. So again, the history theory, questions of architectural history, but also the larger questions of architecture, I would say brackets, if you will, our first year, the first year of the curriculum. Then with Studio 2 in the spring, architecture, thinking about architecture as the production of knowledge and how do we engage architecture as research. The studio focused on damage control, which looks at architecture in relationship to planetary issues, environmental issues, ecological issues, as well as architecture as a form of media. Again, keywords similar to the first semester. Then we have structures in architecture as part of the technology sequence, ADR to the architectural drawing class, questions in architectural history. And then in the third semester, we have architecture and situated practice, states of housing, the technology course, materials and assemblies, AT, or architectural technology 3, which happens simultaneously to architectural technology 4, which is building systems integration, and our history theory distribution requirements. And in studios 4, 5, and 6, or semesters 4, 5, and 6, you will then have the option, and actually you'll have the option starting in the second semester, of selecting the critics that you would like to work with. In Studio 4, focused on architecture at a kind of territorial scale with a theme of contested territories, ecology, environment, carbonization, extraction, equity, and reparation. Similar keywords, if you will, but thinking transscalarly in terms of materiality, space, structure, detail, and relations. That also works in tandem with our AT4 course, which is construction and life cycle of materials. So thinking about, the origin of those materials, where do they come from, how do they then sort of translate or then be transformed, if you will, into architectural detail, and our electives and distribution requirements. So after your third semester, the curriculum opens up a bit, which then leaves you sort of more room to, I would say, to kind of craft your way through the rest of the curriculum. So you'll take most of your required courses in the first 3 semesters, but then you'll see that there are opportunities for you to really sort of curate, if you will, the studios that you take, the electives that you're taking, and the questions that you're asking. Then in Studio 5 and 6, practicing uncertainty and thinking about architecture's entanglement, if you will, with coloniality and modernity, and also how do we practice relative to these conditions. And then here, if you go to the GSAP website, to the M.Arch portion of the website, you'll see the distribution of how those colored bars, if you will, sort of break down into the courses, what your curriculum will look like for the three years that you are here, and again, the opportunities for you to, let's say, plug into the curriculum your specific interests. So I'm going to ask Professor Maria Lizarraga to briefly talk about the first year, particularly because first year and second year midterm reviews are going on this week, and hopefully if you haven't had an opportunity to visit the studios, you'll have some time this afternoon to pass by some of the reviews as well as I'm sure Maria is going to mention the exhibition that's on the 400 level, but I'll turn it over to Maria for a few minutes here. Maria Lizarraga.
Thank you, Mario. Welcome everybody. We have had the chance to speak for a while during lunch. So I'm teaching, I'm coordinating and teaching the first semester of Design Studio, which we have called Forms of Mixture, Architecture and Ecology and Transformation. And so we have heard from the Dean and then from Mario, and it is part of the strong curriculum at GSAP that architecture is not an isolated fact. It expands its consequences of building architecture to a planetary scale, and so it is engaged in many fights of power, hegemonies, and controversies, and other kinds of relationships, which ultimately affect many of the living species of the planet. And in the first semester of Design Studio, we are going to try to expand this notion of ecology within the field of architecture, and try to start talking about how design is also related. It's going to be research-based, as the Dean was mentioning before. And so we're going to do that through 4 different exercises, 4 different scales, also 4 different formats or medias in which to represent architecture. Architecture is also facing the current crisis derived from climate change are also a crisis of representation. So we are also going to in this semester, hectic semester, if you have the chance to go. I know that you went already to Studio 1. The students are working on their models of their third exercise. We're going to work in these 4 different scales. No, first one is this that we call the body ecology, where we have to build one-to-one devices that mediate between us and our environment, and try to propose more ecological relationships. The second exercise is a representational exercise. This is metabolic section that, as Mario mentioned, we have the drawings of the students exhibited at the 4th floor at Avery. You can see the results of what the students did. What they have to do is to represent a process that takes part in architecture, either extraction of a material or an energetic process and so on, and draw its whole complete metabolic cycle, acknowledging that architecture is also transscalar, that it draws from the microscopic scale to the planetary scale, and it also has an impact on many time frames and scales. The next exercise that the students are working on and presenting this semester is the garden, in which they are working in this program that is a mediation space par excellence, in which they are having to negotiate amongst many different agents, from the non-humans and humans and so on. And in the 4th one, they are going to do this to go to the scale of the territory and have to design this synthetic climate. No? So these are some images of the body ecologies that we did through this kind of material picnic, where the students had this big collection of materials in order to be able to develop their body ecologies. And so you see a little bit of what they did for the occasion. Or this metabolic section. These are some examples of this year's projects that you will see in this exhibition upstairs. And so we every time have these different science fairs. We have 7 faculty members that are guiding 7 different studios, and so we very often do these collective sessions in order to see what other studios are doing with the same syllabus. This is the project that they are developing right now, and these are and they are working also in model, establishing contacts with the making studio, and also working with all of the tools that we have, but also doing this kind of performative and drawings and metabolic drawings And the last exercise is this one of the synthetic climate, where they are going to have to facilitate certain conditions in order to generate a certain climate. And this is, of course, we have different kinds of like we have like class 3 days a week. So from collective sessions to reviews where we invite external examiners, to exhibitions, to this lecture series where we invite people from outside GISA, but also people inside GISA. We're having David Benjamin next Monday, which is the coordinator of Core 2. And yeah, as I mentioned before, this is carried out by 7 different faculty members that each of them bring their own perspective to the program, although we're all following the same program, no? And I will leave it here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Design Studio 3 is the housing studio, and housing has been being taught here at GSAP for over 40 years, 45 years now. I'm just actually going to ask Professor Gali Solomonov just to say a couple of words about the housing studio, and then I'll just kind of show you a few things about the housing studio.
Thank you, Mario. So the Housing Studio is a long-standing studio. It deals with collective housing, usually in a site in the city of New York. And we try our best to guide the semester to be one where we focus our attention to multiple dwellings for the most people with the least resources and with the most advantageous situation in terms of environmental possibilities. And we visit different sites in the city of New York. New York has a very interesting story of many different examples of housing in New York City. And it's a kind of living laboratory of multiple dwellings. And we work in teams of 2. The teams are, you have a year to meet a partner to work in this semester, and it's usually, the semester is divided in two parts. The first one is a research part, and it's about 3 weeks of intense research looking at the city of New York and looking at many housing around the world. And then the second part is an original design in a site that we provide to the entire studio.
Thank you, Galia. And these are just a little taste of what's happened thus far this semester in the housing studio. And again, mid-reviews are going on now, have started today, so hopefully you'll have some opportunity to see what's going on there. This, for a number of years, the studio has worked on sites in the Bronx and in Upper Manhattan and Harlem, and this year the studio is working on a site in the East Village. And it also brings in issues of, again, not just housing, but housing related to the environment, related to gardens, related to, I would say, a kind of politics, if you will, of the urban environment. And again, you're welcome to visit the reviews. The site is, let's see if I can point to it. Is that site between East 4th and East 5th Street, near, what is that? That is First Avenue. And these are just some photos from, was this the first excerpt, first review of group work this semester? beginning with some site analysis and also looking at buildings in the area, in the context. And why is this important? Of course, if you look at this statistic, the average rent in New York City is $4,200 a month. To not be burdened, to be salary burdened, one would have to, or a family would have to earn or have an income of $180,000 or greater. And I would say, housing is not just an issue in terms of New York City, but it's a global issue. It is also one of the issues that we have had conversations around as part of our actioning summit and also our coalition conversations. And then Studio 5, we had our mid-reviews last week, but if you go up to the 600 level, you can visit those studios and you will probably see some work from models, constructions, large-scale drawings from their mid-reviews focused on the theme for this semester is on collectivity and the practice of uncertainty. This is the idea of uncertainty and collective action, looking at the ideas around possibilism by Albert O. Hirschman, who was an economics professor at Columbia, and how do we think not just as individuals, but think collectively in order to bring about change at different kinds of scales. And so all of our studios, as you saw with first year, having a lecture series that happens on Wednesdays, with second year studios also having a lecture series. The third year, our series this fall is called On Collectivity. Our first one was with Selena Sue, and then we have of the Belladonna Collaborative, we have Tomi Arai of the China Art Brigade coming up, as well as Meredith Chinhor of the Aggregate Architectural History Collaborative for our final one of the semester. And what's really kind of incredible, if you will, once you get, let me just kind of go back, here we go, to the third year, is that, let's see here. Here you go. You will have 17 or 18 different studios to select from. So you can see some of the topics for this fall, new program, new technologies, new topologies. Professor Michael Bell, who's here today. David Benjamin's studio, Vital Reimagining Buildings and Carbon at Scale, to Professor Mark Surmaki's studio in Permanent Matters, Biogenic Materials and Regenerative Systems in Jamaica Bay. So again, studios which are tackling and asking questions about a number of different topics at a number of different scales, and some of the work from last fall's Studio 5. This is from Professor Emmanuel Admazu's studio, which was called, it was about sort of immeasurability, working in Harlem. I co-taught a studio with composer Raven Chacon, in which students selected their own sites, and we treated the studio as a kind of mini thesis. David Benjamin's studio, Professor Benjamin is here, a project dealing with sort of ecology. And I'll be brief. Professor Lucia Alay was not able to be here. She is coordinating the history theory sequence. I would say GSAP has perhaps the world's foremost faculty history theory faculty. Professor Reinhold Martin, Mary McLeod, Mabel O. Wilson, these are our full-time faculty, Atia Korakawa, Professor Mark Wigley, Dean Emeritus Mark Wigley, Felicity Scott, and Lucia L.A. Professor L.A. Made this presentation for our first year students and for faculty a couple of weeks ago. This is Sir Bannister Fletcher's The Tree of Architecture, and as Professor L.A. said, you can look at this and you can sort of see how Bannister Fletcher organized architecture, what was prioritized, what was, let's say, undervalued, but we don't teach history this way, as she says. Then in the modernist period, Alfred Barr, who was a curator at the Museum of Modern Art, that tree, if you will, is now, let's say, turned upside down and turned into a kind of mechanical drawing. But you can also sort of see how it's constructed with modernism as kind of the main emphasis there, and recognizing also other influences such as what at the time was being called Negro sculpture, and its influences upon Cubism. But again, we don't teach architecture this way. Charles Jenks in the 1970s then sort of takes that tree, if you will, becomes, let's say, more biomorphic, but oriented horizontally in terms of the isms of modernism, if you will. However, here at GSAP, we teach history across space and time, so we teach it geographically geographically and temporally, and so it may not be out of place, let's say, to examine the French Revolution while also discussing the Haitian Revolution and understanding what was going on in the colonies at the same time as, let's say, the canon, if you will, was developing in Europe and the Americas. And these two very interesting sort of maps understanding the construction of, let's say, empire and also the construction of nation states. And to give you just a kind of sense of, the breadth of the ways in which we consider history, yes, from, those of you perhaps have an undergraduate degree, I'm sure that, yes, you've covered Boulay, but what you perhaps did not cover in your architectural history course is W.E.B. Du Bois and Du Bois, let's say, conception of the relationship between sort of history and race in this kind of early diagram in which he assesses value of household and kitchen furniture owned by Georgia Negroes. And then, so yes, you will look at, quote unquote, the historical, but also, let's say, the more contemporary, whether or not it's, and I'm calling this contemporary, although it's over 40 years old or 50 years old, Delirious New York, to sort of current thinkings in architecture, the current Venice Biennale. Lucia talks about sort of, this is the Google scan. Lucia does a much better job of describing what we're looking at than I do, so I'm going to move on beyond this. But also understanding, and this is where if you go and spend time in Avery Library, you should get to know the N section and the NA section, and perhaps also if you find yourself really well settled in there, you will perhaps know what books you will find under NA 1058.S34. I won't tell you, but I will say go to Avery Library and you can see which architectural monograph that is. But that's how I would hope that you might become, let's say, intimately familiar with architectural history and how we want to kind of, let's say, think about architectural history and put it into context. Professor Lola Benalan could not stay and had another appointment, but I just want to kind of quickly go through the building tech sequence. And not only do we have the required courses that I mentioned to you, but also a plethora, if you will, of elective courses, thinking about structures, materials, assemblies, and construction. And one of the things I would also say that, we are always experimenting with materials. We get our hands dirty with full-scale materials. This also, we think about how materials and construction are represented, and this coincides with our representation sequence. We think about materials relative to the environment and how that's situated, let's say, within the broader knowledge of architectural technology. So this is architectural technology 1, environments and technology. And some of the work that the students will do, structures in architecture, really treating structures intuitively. In architectural technology 3 and 4, students form practice groups, and they put together detailed drawings looking at building envelopes, but also looking at building systems. And in AT5, students learned what goes into the assembly of building systems, of wall systems, of architectural construction. And so, we make full-scale details. And being in New York really offers us, or affords us, the opportunity to have, at our disposal, engineers and architects and others working in the built environment who come in and work as mentors, as roving engineers in our courses, and also in our tech courses, and also in the studios. The tech sequence is supplemented by tech talks and what was called the tech shop. And we're really thinking about materials. Again, this was a materials conference from a year ago, and Professor Benalon is also now working on a kind of material archive. And then finally, Professor Benalon is the director of the Natural Materials Lab, which you will find next door to our making studio in Schermerhorn. The representation sequence. A few years ago, we made the decision to rename what was called visual studies representation, as a way of opening up how we think about architectural representation, not just in terms of digital representation and drawing, but in terms of time-based media, performance, installation, storytelling, graphic design. And so although we have 2 required courses, ADR1 and ADR2, we have, again, a plethora of electives which we are able to explore other modes of architectural representation, whether or not those modes might be performance, they might be movement, other kinds of representational techniques, how we assemble evidence, so architecture or drawing, not just as documentation, but also as analysis and as evidence, as being evidentiary, if you will. And working very closely in terms of drawing relationships between things. So the architectural representation is not simply focused on form and architecture as a discrete object, but architecture as part of a larger ecological system. So assembling evidence in a myriad of different ways, processes, and then how does that become, let's say, public-facing, How does that manifest itself? We began last year a series of talks called the Drawing Project, which are primarily for our first and second year students, in which we have our own professors, but also guests speak about architectural representation. And this gives you some of, I was just showing you what we have going on this fall. This gives you a little bit of taste of what happens in the second semester of that sequence. And then we have our professional practice sequence, in which we not just kind of speak about the sort of the nuts and bolts, if you will, of professional practice, but we actually ask the question, what is practice? What does it mean to practice? How do we construct practice? And what are new forms of practice? So we consider, the historical legacy, if you will, of architectural practice. But what does that mean for us today? So we think about issues of labor. We think about issues of gender and equity in terms of architectural practice. And how can new forms of practice address the legacies of coloniality and modernity? Our professional practice sequence also engages bringing people together to rethink practice in relationship to issues such as climate, equity, and labor, as I mentioned. Thinking about practice in terms of what might it mean to construct an activist practice. This is from March of 2024. And architectural practice is not simply theorized, but in our required course, our students actually propose new forms of practice and we actually ask them to put together a business plan and to perform and to present their business plan before a jury, if you will, and then later they and their, let's say, new form of practice respond to a request for a proposal. They submit that as a written document, but also present themselves in the form of a job interview, if you will, the ways in which an architectural practice might do that. And here's just one of the practices. This was a response to an RFP, which is a request for proposal, using a site in the city that the New York Department of Housing was developing. And here are students presenting their proposal before, quote unquote, the selection committee. Before I finish, I just really want to encourage you also to delve into the GSAP website, to our end of the year show from 2025, and there you can find more information about student work from different courses. And so here you can also see how the programs are related, and you can also find portfolios. So you can actually kind of see what graduates of GSAP have produced over their 3 years here. So with that, I'm going to end this part of the presentation. I want to actually call up right now Professor Mark Surmaki, who will be the incoming director of the Master of Architecture program. You will get to know Professor Surmaki perhaps quite well, because he will be leading the admissions process coming this spring. But I'd like to ask Mark if you'd like to say a few words.
Hi, so first of all, welcome. Fantastic to see everybody here today, and I'm really looking forward to the potential of working with you as we kind of move into the spring. Thank you, Mario, for the introduction, and just so everyone knows, Mario is not disappearing from GSAP, but there's just kind of internal shifts in terms of organization and directorship of the program, which I'm very excited and happy to step into. I don't want to make a long formal statement because I think it's much more important for us to get to addressing your specific questions. But maybe just to reinforce a couple of ideas about the school that you've already heard and you've absorbed, I'm sure, a lot today and will continue to be doing so. But one is just this notion of that we don't presume to know what architecture is. I want to because I think it's super important, but I also want to reinforce that's not because the school is devoid of expertise and knowledge, right? Quite the opposite, right? The people that you're working with are really at the forefront of architectural discourse and practice, both within New York City and globally. There's a kind of an amazing faculty that you'll be working with if you come here. But they're precisely the people who are raising questions about the status, nature, and boundaries of architecture, right? And the role that it can play in the world, right? So just as architecture is not a stable singular object, right? That we very much at the school, and Maria has spoken to this already, don't think about the building as an isolated, autonomous, static form. We think about it in relationship to the complex network of ecological, political, social, and technological forces that invariably kind of entangle it and with which it is sort of engaged. That architecture is not either a stable object of knowledge. So when we say that we don't have preconceptions about what architecture is, what we mean is that we're not interested in inculcating you within some pre-formulated set of conventions, kind of received notions of architecture that somehow we feel are sort of doctrinaire or canonical. We're really interested in working with each of you to really question, right, what it means to practice architecture and to engage in architecture in a world that's increasingly complex, that's increasingly in various states of intersecting and entangled crises, right? So whether we're thinking about the kind of troubled political status of the world, whether we're thinking about these questions of climate and carbon that I think kind of undergird much of our research and thinking at GSAP, we're really interested in producing people who will be kind of operating in ways that are really pushing the discipline and the practice of architecture forward in new ways, opening up new methods of practice, opening up new modes of inquiry rather than sort of reiterating the known, right? So that's, I think, a kind of critical thing to think about. The last thing I would say, because I will have hopefully plenty of time to interact in the future if you come to GSAP, is really this idea of GSAP's engagement with New York and beyond that with the kind of larger global context. And to come to GSAP, I think, is so enriched by its relationship to the city, both in terms of the community of architects, engineers, thinkers, historians, and curators, the kind of sort of rich ecosystem of institutions and organizations within the city, but the ways in which our own, again, our faculty are very, very much part of that community, part of that ecology, and the kind of interface between the school and the kind of larger context of the city, I think, is really one of the most sort of powerful and important parts of GSAP as a program, right? So I'll stop there because I think we have kind of plenty to think about. But yeah, super excited to be stepping into this role, and I hope I will have the opportunity to interact with each of you in the near future. So thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And so I think we have a little less than 15 minutes or so. So I'm going to ask Galia and Maria, and Professor Michael Bell, and Mark come up, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. Let me also, I'm sure that you met him earlier today. This is Darwin Ng again, who is the Associate Director of the Master of Architecture program. You will also get to know Darwin quite well if you come here to GSAP. So any questions?
I have one question for you guys. For the architectural representation section, you said that
interesting question. I've been in New York for 30 years, at Columbia 20 years. And I think this is a moment of transition. It's not, we are working with the most internal integrity as we can, and working with everyone in a positive fashion. But there are limits to what we are doing within the city and within campus. And I believe this is not the first time that we have a challenge. During COVID, it was also, instead of being public-facing and in our bodies, kind of meeting in places, we were online. So I think that in the same way that was a break in the tradition of Columbia, I believe we will soon be open to the public and people using 116th Street as it was meant to be, an easement where the city and public and the university interact. So I hope to see people in this lecture hall and dogs and babies walking around 116th Street as it was a few years ago.
Yeah, and I'll just add that although there are, let's say, physical restrictions in terms of access to the campus, that hasn't changed what we do in GSAP. So the work that we were doing before, we're still doing that work. We are still inviting, outside reviewers to come to the school. We have the deans visiting critics who are teaching studios and participating, in programs. So if you go upstairs today, you will see that we have Professor Imani Jacqueline Brown, who's worked with forensic architecture in London, is leading a clinic. Sumaya Valley, a South African architect, is one of our dean's visiting critics. So we're remaining engaged, although there may be, let's say, physical limits that have been set up by the university. We're still doing the work, if you will. We are very mindful of how we make that work, let's say, public in terms of the exposure that our students or our faculty may have, but that hasn't stopped the conversation. But thanks for that question. That's a really good question. Any other questions?
Can you talk a little bit about how you teach design process, especially in the first 2 years?
Mark, would you like to?
Can you repeat that?
Can you talk a little bit about how you teach design process in the first 2 years?
Yeah, and maybe Maria, since she's teaching Core 1, can follow up on this. But just to say, I think in the first 2 years, because people are coming from diverse backgrounds, some from previous architectural degrees, some from philosophy or economics or what have you, that there's a combination of trying to provide everyone with the necessary kind of tools and skills required to kind of pursue the work and to enact their ideas in the most compelling ways possible, while at the same time experimenting, right? As you've heard, right, today, these kind of notions of experimentation and questioning, I think, are very kind of core to the values of the school. And so I think that's a challenging, I think, balance, but I think it's one that we try to achieve, and why I think there is such a focus, as Mario was describing, relative to the representation sequence, which is structured to provide for introduction to drawing techniques, to softwares, to modeling procedures, at the same time as it's kind of, I think, encouraging students to experiment with those modes of working. The problems are set up, particularly in the first couple of semesters, relative to specific ways of operating, right? So as Maria was showing, right, there might be a very exacting drawing exercise, a very specific exercise related to model making. That continues in the second semester of the first year as well. So the structure of the initial 2 studio sequences is, I think, kind of calibrated in a way to allow for people to not be overwhelmed with having to be able to do everything all at once, but being able to kind of target the building of skills throughout the sequence. Now, as the sequence progresses and proceeds, that expands, right? And I think people acquire skills. I think one of the amazing things about being in an M.Arch program is that you do have people who are coming from diverse backgrounds who are kind of osmotically gaining from each other's bases of knowledge, right? So people who don't have architectural backgrounds are learning from the people who do, and ultimately also from the AAD, the Advanced Architectural Design students who are coming in who have previous professional degrees, who you'll be interfacing with in the final 2 semesters here. So I think that it kind of expands, it gets more complex by the time you get to the housing studio, and I think, Galia, you can probably attest to this, everybody, whether you're coming from an architectural background or from a completely unrelated discipline, has the capacity to kind of engage in the complexities of those kinds of, sophisticated architectural and urban questions.
Yeah, I would say that, for people coming from different backgrounds into architecture, it's incredible how quickly the group that has architecture background with a group that doesn't merge and learn from each other. And it's wonderful when you get to housing and you have somebody that had architectural background working with somebody that was studying pre-med or engineering or literature, and how the questions of one and the experience of one is affected by the other. And for somebody like me that have been teaching for many years, from the initiation of digital programs and digital technologies, it's even faster now than it was 10 years ago, where the learning curve of thinking three-dimensionally and thinking architecturally and learning the codes and the rules of space making come very quickly together in the first year. So it's it's not uncommon to see somebody, to see in a group of 12 students. Usually our teams, our units are 12 students. To see 12 students in the first year where you see the difference, and then to encounter them in the third semester, a year later, and not be able to tell who comes from where. And right now I have 12 students in housing. I do not know who has architectural background and who doesn't. And I would not be able, if you ask me, you saw some of my students earlier today, I actually don't know if Luca and Efran that was here, they were here before, if they have architectural background or not. And they're working wonderfully together and in a group of 12. So that is, that's something not to be intimidated by.
Yeah, I'll just add that, I think one of the fantastic things about the first semester is I will say that, particularly within the design studio, is that it meets you where you are. So the material picnic, and Maria can speak more to this, is this kind of event, if you will, or thing that happens where, regardless of whether or not one has an architectural background or not, you immediately dive into working with materials in a way in which your preconceptions about architecture are immediately sort of challenged. So I would say that not only, through, particularly in the first 3 semesters, yes, students without a background are learning from students with a background, but students with a background are actually being challenged and learning from students without a background. So it's not formulaic. I think it's kind of strategized. I won't say set up, but strategized to really kind of allow the exploration to open up possibilities rather than saying that there's a prescribed way in which, let's say, design methodology happens. But Maria, I don't know if you want to say more about the material picnic or
I think
happens.
you said a lot. It's true that the first exercise that we give to the students, we try to, because of course there's a difference between who is coming from architecture background and who is not. And I think this material picnic is like making everybody feel the same, because it's true that even like when you have an architecture background, you have all the weight of architecture on top of your head, and you are like more paralyzed when doing this kind of experimentation with materials and so on. And the ones that don't have an architecture background are like a little bit fresher in that sense. So then when we arrive to the other exercises where like we have to work very much on drawing skills or model skills and so on, there's already kind of a kinship between students and camaraderie, so that they work together very well, no? So yeah, so I think everything has been said, but it's true that in the first semester we focus very much on like trying to do lots of exercise and start over and over again, and like work in across many different scales and many different formats of representation and of submission, but also like engage into critical design and how architecture and design is in a way mediating our lives, and it can generate more democratic societies or more privileged societies. So to like train that a lot and gain skills on that, and then when you come, like then I teach Advanced 6, which is the last semester, to like keep on working in this, no? As the Dean was saying before, we are like a research-based universities, and trying to work always in these two kind of design and research through the methodology that we follow across the semester.
Yeah, and just to briefly underscore that last point, because we were talking a lot about process in the form of literal process of making things, but I think there's also the question of process relative to these notions of kind of research and how that translates into a design project, for example. And so I think, as Maria is saying, we don't make a distinction between, let's say, teaching fundamentals and giving you kind of clearly, let's say, kind of cookie cutter requirements in the early studios that then emerge into more complex research problems in the later studios. We really think about, from the beginning, even beginning in the first year of the program, asking people to ask critical questions and to kind of formulate their own research trajectories, and to kind of work with them on a kind of very one-to-one basis to formulate and understand how that translates into an architectural proposition, right? So I think there's a lot of that kind of let's say, research-driven and I think deep thinking about the broader context of our projects, the larger conditions in which architecture is kind of embedded, and then formulating interventions based on each student's encounter with those questions, and really allowing everybody to start to really kind of surface what it is that they find most kind of compelling and critical. But I'm sorry, Michael, you were going to say.
No, it's I had the first question on my mind still. It's and they all loop back. My name's Michael Bell. I've been teaching here since 2000, and I ran the core studios for 15 years. So these questions always came up. But in that period of time, I'm thinking of the number, reflecting on Galio's comment, the number of times the campus was really impinged in serious ways. 9/11, 2008, COVID, and today, and certainly historically. But I think it ties into the question you had as well, is we're a professional school, and there's an imperative to basically be accredited. You can imagine what that means, right? At the same time, I don't think any school of architecture presumes that they really know how to deal with the problems of the world today. So my entire experience in architecture school since being an undergrad was a kind of process of trying to be both tied to the discipline, understand its history, at the same time deal with imagining needs that are not met. And there's a beautiful passage from, I believe it's, forgetting for the moment, but it should be Frederick Jameson. Architecture schools end up helping memorialize needs they cannot meet. So there's a huge kind of project, I think, in all of the more inventive architecture schools to try to imagine what is the process of teaching architecture, whether it's design, structures, or whatever, versus imagining needs that for which there's no real professional connection. You can't reach those needs. But most of the people in the world have unmet needs, if not architectural ones. So I think we are always kind of overcoming our privateness versus our insularity, forces that are imposed on us for sometimes justified means versus aspirations to meet something much, much larger. So, and then where that reflects in the curriculum, I think today, as opposed to even 25 years ago, but frankly, 1988, when Bernard Tschumi took over as dean, was an attempt to produce core classes, maybe for 100 people, taught by 6, 7, 8, 10 people, that are structured enough to be a professional school, but flexible enough to allow a real individuality of the professor and the student. So I think that is absolutely, I mean, we've all been to the other major peer schools, whether they're UCLA, Berkeley, or Harvard, or Yale, or Princeton, or Michigan, UVA. But I think GSAP has always had a pretty deep aspiration that there is both structure and flexibility, even at the earliest level. And that continues today. I know it continues with Mireille, I know it continues with Mario, I know it continues with Galia. But make no mistake about it, it makes a question like yours real, because the process, if that's what one calls it, in Studio A versus Studio B in the same semester might be very different. And you know, Columbia has always kind of championed a lottery process so students have some choice. It doesn't always work out, but that is really a difference. We're simply always in that pivot point. But yes, the closing is not ideal. I must say getting a QR code for people is pretty easy. It frankly hasn't been that hard to get people in, but they don't just walk in. So, those are two great questions.
Hi. So just to kind of dig in a little deeper, how do you continue to evolve the curriculum to really differentiate Columbia from other programs, and also, you know, tied to that, even to determine going forward, like the changing maybe subject matter or focal areas that you might do, and even the teaching styles, right, as students are changing. So just wondering how you continue to look, I mean, what we see today may be very different, right, than what they may see the third year, right, because you're evolving. So just wondering, what do you take into account to do that?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I wish I had a kind of simple answer to it, but I think it points to something that's really vital, is that if we recognize that architecture is subject to and an expression of, and you know, is reciprocally related to all of these shifting forces in the world, right, that we've been talking about, then you always have to adapt, right? That the nature of the program, its content, the format of both the pedagogy, but also the subject matter is changing constantly, right? And so I think that's a lot of what, you know, when we talk about, you know, moving beyond kind of received conventions of the discipline and kind of raising questions and speculating about the kind of boundaries of architecture, I think it's precisely pressing on that uncertainty that Mario invokes, right? That this question of uncertainties we don't know, right? We didn't know COVID would happen. We didn't know, you know, X, Y, and Z. There are things we do know, right, about, for example, the larger climatological trajectory of the planet and the problematics related to that. but even the kind of precise nature of those challenges is shifting, right, all the time. And there are varying scenarios in the science, although on the one hand, precise is also diverse, right? So I think one thing it does mean is that we have to remain flexible, right? I think that takes a number of forms. One is the studios, and kind of ties back to what Mike was saying, the diversity of the studios, particularly really throughout the curriculum, but particularly in the last several semesters, bring into GSAP the people around the world, like literally, right, from around the planet, and you heard a little bit about that today, who are engaging the most relevant questions of the moment, right? And so I think that's, there is an amazing core faculty here, and ranging from the sort of super distinguished history theory faculty to this kind of body of practicing architects and researchers. But I think that, which has always, I think, been part of GSAP, and I would say in a different way, and maybe this is obviously prejudicial on my part, but I think different from, let's say, the conventional practice of bringing in the biggest name architects and to teach advanced studios for a couple of days during the week, and not necessarily paying enough attention to the students. What I think we really try to engage are maybe the people who aren't the biggest names necessarily, but the people who we feel are really doing the most kind of critical, compelling, important work on the subjects and areas kind of impacted by and related to architecture that we that we're aware of, right, at the given moment in time. And that involves really a kind of a process of curation, right? And so the advanced studios are really an evolving organism that are kind of changing on an annual kind of semester to semester basis, precisely in a sense to allow for that kind of accommodation to be made. Obviously, we're also making structural changes, curricular changes. We're like reevaluating the nature of the pedagogy on an ongoing basis, both in terms of things like evolving methodologies for representation, technologies, softwares. Obviously, like a pressing concern now being the questions around AI, for example. But also just, what does it mean to teach, right? And how do we engage with students in the most productive ways possible? So I know that's an incomplete answer, but
I'll just add that we're also not just talking to each other in terms of the discipline. We're not just talking to other architects, whether or not they're inside the school or outside the school. We're talking to a larger community of thinkers. So whether or not that's Denise Farah da Silva, who's a philosopher and critical thinker, writer, or Deborah Danowski and Eduardo Vivero de Castro, who are these Brazilian anthropologist and philosopher who have been engaged with our studios. I mentioned co-teaching with Raven Chacon, who is not a designer, but is an artist and actually more so a composer. So we're bringing in, and I should say, an indigenous composer. So we're having conversations with people outside of the discipline. And then second, I will say that that's part of, let's say, the curriculum is an ongoing project. It is also a project. It's a design project. It is something that we're constantly sort of talking about, that we're constantly working on. And just to reinforce what Mark just said, in terms of, and I think that's what makes being here in New York advantageous, is that we have critical thinkers who are coming through New York City all of the time that we can engage with. Also here at the university, from Jack Halberstam to astrophysicists like Catherine Oppenheimer. We bring in, people outside of the discipline to help us think about what it is that we should be thinking about, if you will. And I think that's very important, that we continue to have, look outside of ourselves, look beyond the discipline.
I was just going to add that, we have the privilege of being in the city of New York in a very central university. And so if your interest is the moment that architecture touches something else, there's always this wealth of people coming through the city and through the university. And so just to give you an example, a couple of weeks ago, the Prime Minister of Spain was in town, and a conversation was organized with the students, and he happened to be interested in architecture, and he talked to us about what Spain is doing in terms of public housing and things like that. And then in a couple of weeks, we are having a group of people coming from Chile that work in laminated wood in Chile, and Mexico and Brazil. And this is the groups that I happen to know, but any one of us has multiple links because we speak another language, or we are from another part of the world, or we are in connection with this other university or this other group. And so one of the amazing things about being a student here is that you can tap in your multiplicity of what makes you you, whether you are from Michigan or whether you are from, Argentina or Brussels. And so that these things kind of come together in multiple ways. And I think that one of the things that we do very well is we collaborate very well. We collaborate in multi-tiers. Also, this school is of architecture, planning, preservation, real estate. And so it's one of the few schools that has real estate within architecture, not within the business school. So for example, in my housing group, I have 4 students that are dual major between real estate and architecture. And they bring a very interesting perspective to the group. So I think this kind of amoeba that we are is enriched by kind of all the things that by osmosis we kind of bring into the nuclei.
I think that we could probably talk for longer, but our time might be up. And I also want to make sure that you have time to visit studios, visit reviews, but also we will see you at the reception. I think there's a reception before the talk. And then please, I also want to encourage you to stick around this evening for the lecture by Ada Tola and Giuseppe Legnano of Low-Tech, which promises to be super, super, super fantastic. So thank you very much for your time, and thanks for being here today.